Cordiali saluti da Strasburgo. I wish you all a happy and successful Public Domain Festival. You have made the right choice in calling it a festival because the public domain in all its color and richness deserves nothing less than celebration and appreciation. Public domain is not a place where you visit, look at it passively and then leave. It's an ecosystem to which you are invited to contribute by sharing, using and adding. Thank you all for being part of this. Speaking of contributing, there's still work to be done in order to make the public domain truly sustainable and accessible in the digital age. I briefly talk about my work in the European Parliament and how it can affect the public domain. First of all, contribution to the public domain is generally pretty easy and consists of only two simple steps that we all do. First, you die. Second, you have to wait, which is quite easy because you are dead, so you shouldn't mind waiting too much. Only 70 years later, on January 1st the following year, all of your works will enter the public domain. Every work that will have survived this period, preserved by a library or an archive perhaps, will be free of copyright protection. Unfortunately, many works are lost along the way because the term of copyright protection is quite long and cultural heritage institutions like libraries and archives don't always have the necessary exceptions under copyright and the resources to preserve all of our cultural heritage. With the explosion in the creation of born digital works, this task has become even more difficult and a modernization of copyright is more needed than ever to preserve our cultural heritage. 2 years ago, the European Parliament appointed me as the rapporteur for a review of the 2001 Copyright Directive. As part of this work, I particularly paid attention to the effect of existing copyright legislation on the public domain and made recommendations to safeguard it. In the end, the European Parliament adopted the following recommendations on the public domain with a large majority. First, the European Parliament calls on the Commission to effectively safeguard public domain works, which are by definition not subject to copyright protection. It urges the Commission, therefore, to clarify that once a work is in the public domain, any digitization of the work, which does not constitute a new or transformative work, stays in the public domain. And secondly, it also calls on the Commission to examine whether rights holders can be given the right to dedicate their works to the public domain in whole or in part. Depending on what you do and where you live in Europe, you might have encountered the first issue already in your own work. You find a photography of an 18th century painting perhaps, and only discover that the institution owning the physical painting or perhaps a photographer are claiming copyright on the photograph. Of course, taking a picture of a painting may require some skill, but it is not a new intellectual creation. It's merely changing the original work into a different digital format. So digitizing a public domain work should not give anyone a new right. But the reality is different today. In fact, you might have already heard about lawsuits concerning this. The London-based National Portrait Gallery, for example, threatened to sue a Wikipedian for uploading public domain paintings to Wikipedia Commons, although in the end it didn't follow through with it. Right now, a museum in Mannheim in Germany is suing a Wikipedian for uploading a reproduction of a Richard Wagner portrait by a painter who died already in 1886. I think this clarification in EU copyright law is badly needed to protect the public domain and those who want to interact with it. The second part of my proposal attempted to provide an alternative to death and time as the only means to release your own creation into the public domain, allowing rights holders to freely donate works that they own to the public domain while their hands are still warm. This is not copyright rocket science. This is something that a lot of countries outside of the EU have already successfully done. You might already be familiar with the Creative Commons license model and the CC0 license, which tries to emulate a proper public domain dedication as best as it's possible under the current laws. So the message of the European Parliament to the Commission on the copyright reform has been quite clear. First, clarify that once a work is in the public domain, it stays in the public domain, even when it is digitized. And second, look at how rights holders can be given the right to dedicate their works to the public domain. I encourage you to read the entire report of the European Parliament. It covers a lot more topics of interest. Unfortunately, when the European Commission finally presented its copyright proposal in September, it became clear that it had chosen to fully ignore these recommendations on the public domain. Instead, the Commission has presented changes to the copyright law that go in the opposite direction and will hurt users, cultural institutions and the industry alike. Some parts of the Commission proposal will just annoy you, while others will make you work much harder or increase the cost for compliance. The Commission has made a proposal addressing what they call the so-called value gap. It will affect all people and institutions hosting large amounts of content and providing public access to it. These providers will be required to cooperate with rights holders in various ways, for example by installing content identification systems to automatically detect content to which a person has claimed rights. Anyone familiar with the Content ID system on YouTube will know that these systems are pretty bad at detecting the legitimate use of protected content under a copyright exception. There are also plenty of examples of copyright claims that later turn out to be bogus. For example, individuals or companies claiming exclusive rights on freely licensed content or public sector information released for everyone. While the value gap proposal is directed at companies like YouTube, or YouTube in particular, it will clearly affect a lot more institutions that don't have the same resources to deal with complex legal requirements and millions of individual rights holders. The Commission also plans to introduce a new layer of copyright protection for press publishers, a plan that has spectacularly failed already in both Spain and Germany. Aside of standard copyright protection, the publisher of a press publication is given an extra 20-year-long neighboring right that can be used to prevent third parties from using even small extracts from a newspaper article that are too short to fall under copyright protection. Again, this proposal is aimed at platforms such as Google News, but it will affect users and institutions alike. I have raised this issue with my colleagues in the European Parliament, and we have built a large coalition across the political spectrum in opposition to the introduction of such a harmful neighboring right for press publishers. It is supported by parliamentarians from many countries and party families, including the Italian colleagues Brando Benifei and Isabella Adinolfi. The European Parliament is going to enter its debate on these copyright proposals by the Commission, and there has never been a better time for you to get active and make yourself heard. Contact your MEPs and tell them to use this opportunity of the copyright reform to finally protect the public domain. If you have done so, do it again, this time with your national government, which has a voice in the European Council. With your support, we can both prevent bad legislation from happening and start resuming work on safeguarding the public domain. In 2015, more than 500,000 people came in support for freedom of panorama, the right to take a picture of a building from public ground, when this exception to copyright law was under fire. Although the European Commission has also ignored this issue in its new proposal, some national governments have taken the opportunity to start changing their law. And for example, Belgium now has a full freedom of panorama in its copyright law. This shows that bringing copyright issues to public attention can have a huge impact on the law. We have done this before, and with your help we can do it again. And then we will have another festival. Thank you.